Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember that night so clearly, as if it happened just yesterday. It was one of those nights where sleep feels like a distant dream. My mind was a tangled mess of thoughts, bouncing from one worry to the next. Bills to pay, houses to sell, and the constant pressure of trying to stay ahead in a business where charm is just as important as hard work. I thought maybe lying on the couch and letting my thoughts drift would help me relax, but it didn't. Instead, I found myself staring at the ceiling, the dim glow of the streetlight sneaking through the curtains. Then it happened. My phone buzzed. The sound was sharp and sudden in the silence of the living room. I sat up, startled, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 3 a.m. That alone was strange, because who sends a message at that time? My phone was on the coffee table, screen glowing softly in the dark. I hesitated, a sense of unease settling over me like a cold blanket. Reaching for the phone, I noticed that the number was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was too short, with a strange format that didn't resemble any country code or area code I knew. My first thought was that it must be a spam message. People were always finding new ways to be annoying with prank calls or phishing texts. But then I saw the message. "Do you see me?" That was it. 4 words. No punctuation. No context. My stomach tightened. A message like that could mean anything or nothing, but something about it felt wrong. My thumb hovered over the screen, debating whether to delete it right away or dig deeper. Curiosity got the better of me. I noticed there was an attachment, a photo. My finger trembled as I tapped on it, half expecting some silly meme or a random picture of someone's pet. But what I saw made my breath catch. It was the Victorian house I had been trying to sell downtown, the same house I had visited countless times. The place was a tough sell. Its peeling paint, broken shingles, and creaky old floors had scared away more buyers than I could count. But in this photo, something was wrong. The angles of the house looked distorted, like someone had taken the image and stretched it just enough to feel unsettling. The windows, dark and lifeless in the real world, seemed to have a shadowed presence about them in the picture. All except one. On the second floor, in the far right window, a figure was standing. It wasn't clear enough to see details. No face, no features, but it was unmistakably human. Tall, still, and watching. My throat felt dry, and my chest tightened as I stared at the photo. A strange, cold sensation spread across my arms, and I instinctively glanced around my darkened living room, half expecting to see someone lurking there. "It's just a prank," I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded shaky. I tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced. The thought that someone might be messing with me didn't help ease my nerves. If anything, it made me feel worse. Who would go to the trouble of finding that house, taking such a strange photo and sending it to me in the dead of night? I checked the clock again. 3:02 a.m. My heart thumped in my chest like a distant drumbeat. I decided to block the number immediately. My hands trembled as I opened the settings on my phone, but I was so nervous that I dropped it onto the coffee table with a loud clatter. The sound made me jump, and I let out a shaky breath trying to steady my nerves. When I finally managed to block the number, I told myself it was over. No more weird messages, no more haunting photos. But my mind refused to settle. Even as I forced myself to lie back down, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of that warped house and the shadowy figure in the window. I kept replaying it in my mind over and over, until exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff and groggy. The sunlight streaming through the curtains did little to ease the heaviness in my chest. I sat up on the couch, rubbing my eyes, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad dream. But the moment I grabbed my phone and saw the blocked number in my settings, I knew it wasn't. After a quick shower and some coffee, I decided to distract myself with work. My office wasn't far, just a small, cozy space I shared with a part-time receptionist. By the time I arrived, the caffeine had started to kick in, and I was feeling more like myself. I told myself that last night was a one-off, some bored teenager probably, nothing to worry about. But the unease lingered. Even as I stared at the listings on my computer, trying to focus on the properties that actually had a chance of selling, I found my thoughts drifting back to that photo. I hadn't saved it, but the image was burned into my memory. That warped house, the figure in the window. I shook my head, forcing myself to snap out of it. Around mid-morning, I decided to do a reverse lookup on the strange number just for peace of mind. I wasn't expecting much, maybe nothing at all, but I thought it might help to know where the message had come from. After a quick search, my suspicions were confirmed. The number wasn't listed anywhere. It was invalid or disconnected, like it didn't exist. But then I found something unexpected. In an old newspaper archive, buried among scanned pages from decades ago, I saw a reference to the same number. It had once belonged to a local business, something called Briggs Furniture Restoration. The article was from the 1970s, and it mentioned how the business had closed down after the owner, a man named Albert Briggs, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A cold sweat prickled the back of my neck. A disconnected number. A decades-old disappearance. And now, somehow, that same number was sending me messages in the middle of the night. "This can't be real," I whispered, though I didn't believe my own words. The sound of the office door opening startled me, and I nearly spilled my coffee. My receptionist, Julie, poked her head in with a smile, holding a stack of mail. I forced a smile back and took the envelopes, mumbling a quick thanks. She gave me a curious look, but didn't press me. Once she left, I stared at the mail without really seeing it. My mind was spinning. By lunchtime, I had managed to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Numbers could be spoofed. People could dig up old records. Maybe someone thought it would be funny to send me a message connected to some long-gone business. It didn't mean anything, right? But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit the Victorian house. I told myself it was just to check on the property, to make sure it was still in good condition, but I knew the real reason. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know if there was anything unusual about the place. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by tall, swaying trees and overgrown weeds. Its faded blue paint was peeling in large patches, and the shutters hung crookedly, giving it a forlorn, forgotten look. I parked my car and stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the second-floor window where the figure had been in the photo. It was empty now, just glass reflecting the late afternoon sun. I tried to shake off the unease as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Dust, old wood, and something faintly sour, like mildew. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked through the empty rooms, flashlight in hand. The living room was just as I remembered it. Bare walls, a sagging ceiling, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in decades. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. When I reached the staircase, I paused. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't explain why. I forced myself to climb the stairs, one slow step at a time, until I reached the second floor. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the afternoon light filtering through the windows. I checked the first two bedrooms. Empty. Just cracked plaster and warped floorboards. But when I stepped into the third bedroom, the air felt different. Heavier. There was an old dresser pushed against one wall and a sagging mattress on the floor, covered in a layer of dust. The window overlooked the street, just like in the photo. I approached it slowly, my pulse quickening with each step. I stared outside, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the street, the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic. As I stood there, the floor creaked behind me. I froze. The sound of the creaking floorboard behind me echoed in the silence like a cannon blast. My body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring. I didn't dare move, didn't even turn my head. I stood there frozen, staring out the dusty window, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my pulse in my ears. Hello? My voice barely rose above a whisper, shaky and uncertain. The word felt small and useless in the vast emptiness of the house. Silence. Slowly, I turned around. The bedroom was as I'd left it. Empty, desolate, bathed in the faint gray light filtering through the grimy window. The dresser, the dust-covered mattress, nothing had changed. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Is someone there?" I asked, louder this time. My voice carried down the hallway, its echo bouncing off the cracked walls. Again, no answer. I took a step forward, and the floor groaned under my weight. I shined my flashlight across the room, sweeping it over every corner. Dust particles floated lazily in the beam, but nothing else stirred. My logical mind told me it was just the house settling. That old wood often made noises like this. But the logic didn't stop my hands from trembling or the cold sweat that prickled my neck. I swallowed hard and stepped into the hallway. The air felt heavier here, thicker somehow. My flashlight flickered slightly, the beam stuttering for just a moment before steadying again. I shook it, trying to convince myself it was just low on batteries. I forced myself to check the rest of the upstairs rooms, each one as empty and lifeless as the last. The stillness was suffocating. By the time I reached the end of the hallway, I was gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself, my voice barely audible. But the words felt hollow. No amount of self-reassurance could chase away the feeling that I was being watched. I finally made my way back downstairs, my footsteps cautious and deliberate. The living room greeted me with the same dusty stillness as before. I paused at the base of the staircase, scanning the room one last time before heading toward the front door. That's when I noticed it. A single, faint handprint on the dusty surface of the coffee table in the center of the room. I hadn't seen it when I first came in, but now it stood out starkly against the layer of grime. The print was small, almost childlike, with delicate fingers pressed into the dust. My chest tightened, and my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't touched the coffee table. I knelt down to get a closer look, my heart racing. The edges of the handprint were sharp and clear, as though it had been made only moments ago. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe I missed it earlier. Maybe it was from someone who had toured the house before. But the rationalizations felt flimsy. The house had been locked. No one had been here. No one except me. A sudden noise made me jump, a loud thud coming from upstairs. I spun around, staring at the staircase, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The sound wasn't subtle or ambiguous this time. It was clear, deliberate, like something heavy falling to the floor. I backed toward the front door, my mind screaming at me to leave. But something, curiosity, stubbornness, or maybe just plain stupidity, kept my feet planted. I told myself I needed to know what was going on. After all, this house was my responsibility. If someone was trespassing, I needed to deal with it. At least that's what I told myself. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing up the staircase. "If someone's up there, you need to leave. This is private property." No response. My palms were slick with sweat as I climbed the stairs for the second time that day. Each step felt like an eternity, the old wood creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me, shadowy and quiet. My flashlight swept over the doors, one by one. That's when I noticed the third bedroom door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been before. I was sure of it. I had closed it on my way out. "Is someone in there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart felt like it was lodged in my throat. I stepped closer, inch by inch, until I was standing just outside the door. I reached out with my free hand, pushing it open slowly. The hinges groaned in protest. The room looked the same, dusty, decrepit, lifeless. The dresser and mattress were still there, undisturbed. But as I shined my flashlight around the room, something caught my eye. The mirror on the old dresser. It hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The dresser had been empty, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust. But now, a large, oval-shaped mirror rested against the wall. Its frame was ornate, carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. The glass was murky, its surface mottled with age. My own distorted reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. I stepped closer, unable to tear my gaze away from the mirror. My flashlight's beam danced across the surface, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker, something shifting in the shadows behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection seemed wrong, subtly off. My features were there, but something about the expression wasn't mine. The eyes, the way the lips were slightly parted, it felt foreign, like I was looking at someone wearing my face. A sudden sharp knock at the front door shattered the stillness. I yelped, nearly dropping the flashlight. My heart was in my throat as I stumbled out of the room and hurried down the stairs. The knocking came again, urgent and loud. I reached the front door and flung it open, half expecting to find a police officer or a concerned neighbor. Instead, I was greeted by a man in his late 50s, his face weathered and serious. He wore a brown jacket over a plaid shirt, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. "Are you Sarah Brooks?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "Yes," I said, my voice shaky. "Who are you?" "My name's Thomas Everett," he said. "I'm the caretaker for the property next door. I saw your car outside and thought I should check in." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Caretaker?" He nodded. "I keep an eye on the old Barrett estate. Been doing it for years. Place hasn't had an owner in decades, but the family trusts me to make sure it doesn't fall apart." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You shouldn't be here this late." I frowned. "I'm the listing agent for this house. I was just checking on it." His expression darkened. "This house has a reputation," he said, lowering his voice. "You won't find many buyers around here. People talk. They say strange things happen here." I swallowed hard. "What kind of things?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before leaning in slightly. "People hear voices, see things that aren't there. Some say it's cursed. Others say it's haunted. All I know is that anyone who spends too much time here doesn't come away the same." I wanted to dismiss his words as small-town superstition, but the events of the past 24 hours made it hard to ignore. I forced a weak smile. "I appreciate the warning, but I'll be fine." He didn't look convinced. "Just be careful," he said, his tone grave. "This house doesn't like visitors." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I watched him go, a cold knot forming in my stomach. When I finally stepped back inside and closed the door, the house felt even heavier than before. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The caretaker's words echoed in my mind. "This house doesn't like visitors." I glanced toward the staircase, dread pooling in my chest. I needed to leave. Whatever was going on in this house, it wasn't something I wanted to be a part of. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I froze, my blood running cold. Slowly, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A new message. It was from the same number. You can't leave. The words on my phone's screen, you can't leave, sent a jolt of fear through my body. My breath hitched as I stared at the glowing text, unable to comprehend how or why this was happening. My instincts screamed for me to bolt out the door and never look back, but my feet refused to move. The house seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as though it were alive and feeding off my fear. I gripped the doorknob, ready to yank it open, but the metal was ice cold, sending a sharp sting into my palm. I twisted it anyway. It didn't budge. Locked. No, I whispered, pulling harder. I hadn't locked the door. I hadn't even turned the deadbolt. But now, it was as immovable as if it had been welded shut. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the oppressive silence. I pounded on the door, my desperation growing with every second. The house remained unyielding, silent except for the distant creaks and groans of its aging timbers. A sudden vibration in my hand startled me. My phone buzzed again, and I reluctantly glanced at the screen. Another message had appeared. "You're not ready yet." "What do you want from me?" I yelled, spinning around to face the empty house. My voice cracked, raw with frustration and fear. The shadows seemed to shift in response, growing darker and more pronounced. The faint scent of burning wood wafted through the air, sharp and acrid. The mirror. I hadn't realized my feet were already moving until I found myself at the base of the staircase, staring up at the second floor. The oppressive weight in the air seemed to intensify, pressing down on my chest. A deep, instinctual part of me screamed to stay away, but another part, the part that needed answers, drove me forward. With each step, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I could see my breath misting in front of me. The hallway stretched out like a tunnel, the dim light from my flashlight barely piercing the gloom. At the end of the corridor, the door to the third bedroom stood slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. The mirror's presence felt heavier now, as though it were calling to me. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, and I forced myself forward, one step at a time. The floorboards groaned beneath me, each sound amplified in the suffocating silence. When I reached the doorway, I hesitated. My heart pounded in my chest and my hands trembled. I pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a low creak. The room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one detail. The mirror was no longer leaning against the wall. It was standing upright in the center of the room. I stared at it, my flashlight beam bouncing off the murky glass. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and faint. But as I stepped closer, I realized something was wrong. The reflection wasn't matching my movements. It was watching me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The reflection tilted its head, a small, unnatural movement that sent a shiver down my spine. Its lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass, and then it spoke. "Find the door." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My reflection's mouth hadn't moved, but the voice had come from the mirror, low and resonant. "What door?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The reflection raised its hand, pointing to the corner of the room. I followed its gesture, my flashlight revealing nothing but an empty wall. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass was empty. I spun around, my pulse racing. The room felt different now, as though it had shifted somehow. I shined the flashlight at the wall the reflection had pointed to, and that's when I saw it. A faint outline, barely visible under the peeling wallpaper. It was rectangular, about the size of a small door, and slightly recessed into the wall. My fingers trembled as I reached out, peeling back the layers of brittle wallpaper. The paper tore away easily, revealing a narrow wooden door, its surface scratched and worn. There was no handle, only a small keyhole in the center. As I knelt to examine it, I heard a faint whisper, soft and melodic. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from behind the door. I had no key, no way to open it. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. And then, as if in response to my thoughts, my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking at the screen. "You have the key. Use it." "What key?" I muttered, panic rising in my chest. I checked my pockets, my bag, but there was nothing. Then my gaze fell to the flashlight in my hand. Its surface was smooth and unremarkable, but as I turned it over, I noticed something. A small, concealed compartment near the base. With trembling fingers, I unscrewed it, and a tiny, ornate key slid into my palm. How? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I stared at the key, its surface tarnished and cold. Without thinking, I inserted it into the keyhole. The fit was perfect. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But something deeper, something primal, compelled me forward. I turned the key. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. I shined my flashlight into the void, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Just a quick look, I told myself, though I knew it was a lie. Whatever was down there, I couldn't turn back now. The stairs were narrow and uneven, each step feeling more precarious than the last. The walls were rough, carved from stone, and moisture dripped steadily from the ceiling. The whispers grew louder as I descended, filling the space with an eerie melody. They weren't words exactly, more like fragments of sound that tugged at the edges of my mind. When I reached the bottom, the space opened into a small, circular chamber. The floor was covered in ancient, weathered symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room stood an object, a tall, rectangular frame made of the same ornate wood as the mirror upstairs. Inside the frame was a swirling, shifting surface of black and silver, like liquid metal caught in perpetual motion. I approached it slowly, the whispers growing louder with every step. The frame pulsed faintly, as though alive. I felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing me closer. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" I asked aloud, though I wasn't sure who I was addressing. The whispers faded, replaced by a single resonant voice. "Enter." My body resisted, but my mind was filled with a strange compulsion. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the liquid-like portal. It was cold, almost painfully so, and the moment my hand made contact, a blinding light filled the chamber. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the house, but it wasn't the same. The dust and decay were gone, replaced by warmth and light. The furniture was pristine, the walls freshly painted. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air, and sunlight streamed through clean, sparkling windows. I stood in the living room, disoriented. The coffee table was polished, the handprint gone. Voices echoed from the kitchen, laughter, happy and carefree. I followed the sound, my heart pounding. In the kitchen, a family sat around the table, a man, a woman, and a little girl. They were smiling, passing dishes of food and chatting as though everything was perfectly normal. The little girl turned to me, her eyes wide and knowing. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You set us free." The room began to blur, the colors fading into a wash of light. The warmth vanished, replaced by a growing chill. When I blinked again, I was standing outside the house. My car was parked in the driveway, the keys in my hand. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent once more. I didn't look back. I got in the car and drove away, leaving the house and its secrets behind. The night began like any other at the Hollow Creek Inn. I had worked there for over a year, and I was well accustomed to the quiet monotony that accompanied the night shift. The inn, a modest 3-story building on the edge of a dense forest, rarely saw much excitement. Our usual guests were weary travelers looking for a place to rest before continuing their journey through the remote countryside. It was a Thursday night, around 9 p.m., and I was seated behind the front desk, idly scrolling through some invoices and making notes. The warm glow of the desk lamp provided the only light in the dimly lit lobby. The soft hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors were the only sounds. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl added to the serene yet isolated atmosphere of the place. As I reviewed the guest ledger, the front door creaked open, and a gust of chilly wind swept in, causing me to shiver. A man stepped inside, letting the door close softly behind him. His appearance immediately caught my attention. He was tall and lean, with a gaunt face and dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were wrinkled and looked like they hadn't been changed in days. He clutched a small, worn suitcase, which seemed on the verge of bursting at the seams. He paused just inside the door, his eyes scanning the lobby as if assessing every corner. His gaze lingered on the antique chandelier that hung from the ceiling before finally settling on me. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the front desk. "Good evening," I greeted him, my voice steady, despite the sudden unease his presence brought. "Welcome to Hollow Creek Inn. How can I help you?" "I need a room," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He glanced around again, as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "Room 117 specifically." I frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but we only have 3 floors, and our rooms go up to 115. There is no room 117. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone calm but insistent. "Yes, sir," I replied, turning the monitor toward him. "Here's our floor plan. You can see for yourself that there's no room 117. He leaned in, scrutinizing the screen with a furrowed brow. After a few seconds, he straightened up and shook his head, as if unwilling to accept what he saw. "I need room 117, he repeated, his voice unwavering. "I'm afraid we don't have that room," I said firmly, though a chill ran down my spine. "I can offer you another room, though. We have several available." He remained silent for a few long seconds, his eyes never leaving mine. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "I'll take whatever's available." Relieved, I quickly checked the system and handed him a key to room 102. "Here you go, sir. Room 102 is ready for you. The elevator is just down the hall to your left." He took the key without a word and turned toward the hallway. His footsteps echoed softly as he made his way to the elevator, and I watched him disappear behind the old steel doors. The moment they closed, an inexplicable sense of unease settled over me. Something about the man's insistence on a non-existent room disturbed me deeply. I tried to brush it off as just another odd encounter, telling myself that people sometimes had peculiar habits or requests. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. I returned to my invoices, but my concentration was broken. Every time the elevator dinged, I found myself glancing up, half expecting him to return and ask for room 117 again. As the hours ticked by, the inn remained quiet, with no sign of any unusual activity. The lobby, bathed in the soft glow of the desk lamp, seemed to grow darker and quieter with each passing hour. I tried to distract myself by organizing paperwork and updating reservation records, but the man's request lingered in my mind. At around 2 a.m., just as I was beginning to feel drowsy, the phone on my desk rang, startling me. I glanced at the caller ID and felt my heart skip a beat. The display showed room 117. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. How could that be possible? We didn't have a room 117. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" I said cautiously. All I heard on the other end was a faint static noise, like the distant crackle of an old radio. I tried again. "Hello, is anyone there?" There was no response, just the persistent static. Then, after a few seconds, a soft click, and the line went dead. I slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle, my pulse quickening. I told myself it had to be a glitch in the phone system. The equipment was old, and it wasn't unusual for it to act up from time to time. But seeing room 117 on the display unsettled me deeply. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my arms to shake off the cold that seemed to have settled in my bones. My mind replayed the man's insistence on that room, and the strange phone call. Was it just a coincidence, or was something more sinister at play? Unable to sit still any longer, I decided to do a quick round of the inn to check on everything. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the desk and made my way down the hallway. The familiar creaks of the old wooden floor echoed softly with each step. I started on the second floor where room 102 was located. The hallway was quiet, the soft carpet muffling my footsteps. I passed the familiar doors, each with its brass numbers gleaming in the dim light. 201, 202, 203, and so on. Everything appeared normal. As I approached the end of the hallway, something caught my eye. A faint glow coming from the far end. My heart began to race as I walked toward it. The glow grew brighter with each step until I found myself standing in front of a door I had never seen before. The brass numbers on the door read 117. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The door looked newer than the others, with a sleek, modern handle that seemed out of place in the old inn. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the doorknob. A strange hum filled the air, growing louder as I stood there. My head began to pound, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. Just as I was about to turn the knob, the hallway lights flickered, and the door vanished before my eyes, leaving only a blank wall. I stumbled back, my breathing ragged. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some sort of hallucination? I pressed my hand against the wall where the door had been, but it was solid, unyielding. I made my way back to the front desk, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I sat down, trying to steady my trembling hands. The phone remained silent, and the lobby was still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The rest of the night passed without further incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about that door and the man who had asked for it. As dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But deep down, I knew that whatever had happened that night was far from over. The next morning, the man appeared in the lobby, looking even more haggard than before. He returned his key and asked if he could stay another night. I nodded, my mind racing with questions I wanted to ask but couldn't bring myself to voice. Before he left, he turned to me one last time and said, "Room 117, remember." And with that, he walked out, leaving me with a sinking feeling that the events of that night were only the beginning. The man's words echoed in my mind long after he had left the inn. Room 117, remember. It was a simple sentence, but it carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. As I watched him disappear down the road, I felt an overwhelming urge to uncover the truth behind his cryptic request and the strange occurrences of the previous night. After my shift ended, I went home, but sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door to room 117 and felt the chill of that eerie hallway. By morning, I decided that I couldn't let this go. I needed answers. I returned to the inn early in the afternoon before my next shift. The daytime staff, a small group of friendly and familiar faces, greeted me warmly as I entered the lobby. I casually mentioned the man from the night before and his odd request. "Do you know anything about a room 117? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Sandra, the daytime receptionist, looked puzzled. "Room 117? We don't have a room 117, you know that. Why?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He was really insistent about staying in that specific room. It just struck me as odd. Sandra shrugged. Maybe he was confused. People sometimes get things mixed up, but it's strange he'd ask for a room that doesn't exist. Yeah, it is, I replied, masking my unease. Thanks, Sandra. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to explore the history of the inn and find out if there was ever a room 117. I started with the inn's old records, stored in a dusty storage room in the basement. The room was filled with stacks of yellowed papers, ledgers, and faded photographs. I began sifting through them, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the mystery. Hours passed as I combed through the records. I found documents dating back to the inn's construction in the early 1900s. It had been a family-owned business for decades, changing hands only a few times. I noted the names of the previous owners and any significant renovations that had taken place over the years, but there was no mention of a room 117. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the basement, I came across a faded blueprint of the inn. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded the brittle paper. The blueprint showed the original layout of the building, including all the rooms and their numbers. To my surprise, there was no room 117 listed. However, what caught my attention was an area at the end of the second-floor hallway that seemed to be marked off, but not labeled as a room. It was a small rectangular space adjacent to room 116, but there was no indication of what it was used for. Feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension, I carefully rolled up the blueprint and made my way back upstairs. I knew I had to check that spot again, but this time, I wanted to be prepared. I grabbed a flashlight and a small notebook from the front desk before heading up to the second floor. The hallway was quiet, just as it had been the night before. I walked slowly, counting the doors until I reached room 116. I stood there for a moment, staring at the blank wall where the mysterious door had appeared. The wall looked perfectly normal, with no signs of a hidden passage or door. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and tapped on the wall. It sounded solid, just as I had expected. I tried pressing on different sections, hoping to find a hidden mechanism or a loose panel, but nothing budged. Frustrated, I leaned against the wall, trying to think. That's when I noticed it. A faint draft. It was subtle, but I could feel a cool breeze coming from somewhere behind the wall. My curiosity piqued. I knelt down and examined the base of the wall more closely. There, almost imperceptibly, was a thin line running along the floor, as if marking the edge of a hidden door. I stood back up and pressed my hands against the wall, pushing with more force. Suddenly there was a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark corridor. My heart pounded as I stared into the dimly lit passage. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying a faint, musty odor. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I stepped into the corridor, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for me to walk through without brushing against the walls. As I moved forward, the light from my flashlight revealed another door at the end of the corridor. The door was old, made of heavy wood with a brass handle. Unlike the other doors in the inn, this one had no number on it, just a simple keyhole. I reached out and tried the handle, but it was locked. Determined to see what lay beyond, I retraced my steps back to the lobby. I knew the inn had a master key that could unlock any door, so I rummaged through the desk drawers until I found it. Clutching the key, I hurried back to the hidden corridor and unlocked the mysterious door. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick with dust, and it looked as though no one had been there in decades. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a small desk. On the desk lay a stack of old papers, yellowed with age. I carefully stepped inside, my flashlight illuminating the space. The bed was neatly made, though the linens were faded and moth-eaten. The chair sat in front of the desk, its legs slightly uneven on the wooden floor. I approached the desk and began examining the papers. They appeared to be old letters and journal entries, written in a neat, cursive hand. As I read through them, a chilling story began to unfold. The letters were addressed to a man named Henry, from someone named Margaret. They spoke of love and longing, of dreams for a future together. But as the letters progressed, they grew darker, filled with fear and desperation. Margaret wrote about strange occurrences in the inn, about feeling watched and hearing whispers in the night. She mentioned room 117, calling it a place of secrets and sorrow. The last letter was dated 1923, and it ended abruptly, with Margaret pleading for help and expressing a deep sense of dread. I sat back, my mind racing. Who were Henry and Margaret? What had happened in room 117 all those years ago? And why had the room been hidden away? As I pondered these questions, a sudden noise behind me made me jump. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room. There, in the doorway, stood the man from the night before. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "You found it," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "You found room 117? I nodded, my throat dry. "Who are you? Why were you looking for this room?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "My name is Henry. I've been searching for this room for a long time. Margaret was my great-grandmother. She disappeared from this inn in 1923, and no one ever found out what happened to her." I stared at him in shock, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. "The letters, they're from her?" He nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I've spent years trying to uncover the truth. I believe she was trapped here, in this room. And now, I finally know why." He walked over to the desk and picked up one of the letters, his hands trembling. Margaret wasn't just a guest at this inn. She was part of a dark secret, a secret that was hidden away, along with room 117. As he spoke, a chill ran through the room, and the light from my flashlight flickered. The shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint whisper, like a voice from long ago, echoing through the walls. Henry looked at me, his expression somber. "We need to find out what happened to her, together." I nodded, my resolve firm. "Let's uncover the truth." And with that, we began our investigation into the secrets of room 117, determined to uncover the hidden history of the Hollow Creek Inn and bring Margaret's story to light. The discovery of room 117 had left both Henry and me on edge. The dim light from the single bulb cast long shadows across the dusty room, heightening the sense of mystery. With Margaret's letters in hand and a shared resolve, we were ready to dig deeper into the story that had remained buried for nearly a century. Henry sat down on the wooden chair by the desk, gently placing the letters in front of him. His hands trembled as he traced the delicate handwriting of his great-grandmother. I stood nearby, watching the emotions play across his face: grief, determination, and a deep longing for closure. "We need to understand what happened here," Henry said, breaking the silence. "Margaret was trapped in this room, and her disappearance was no accident." I nodded, determined to help him find the truth. "Let's start by examining everything in this room. There might be clues hidden somewhere." We began our search, carefully sifting through the room's sparse contents. The desk drawers were empty except for a few more old letters, their ink faded and barely legible. The bed yielded nothing but ancient linens and a thin layer of dust. It wasn't until we checked the walls that we found something unusual. Behind the small, framed picture hanging on the wall, we discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn with age. Henry carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with Margaret's handwriting. "This could be it," he whispered, his eyes scanning the pages, her personal account of what happened here. We sat down together, the dim light casting a warm glow over the journal. As Henry read aloud, the story of Margaret's time at the inn unfolded before us. Margaret had arrived at the Hollow Creek Inn in the spring of 1923. She was a young woman seeking respite from the chaos of city life. The inn, with its serene surroundings and charming architecture, seemed like the perfect escape. However, it didn't take long for her to notice that something was amiss. In her journal, Margaret wrote about strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, whispers in the night, and doors that seemed to open and close on their own. She mentioned the other guests, many of whom shared similar experiences. The inn, it seemed, had a reputation for being haunted. Margaret became particularly interested in room 117, which at the time was accessible and occupied by a reclusive guest named Mr. Whitaker. He was an enigmatic figure, rarely seen and always shrouded in mystery. Margaret's curiosity led her to strike up conversations with the staff, who were reluctant to discuss the room or its occupant. Her entries took a darker turn when she described a series of events that began to unfold. One night she heard a loud commotion coming from room 117. Concerned, she ventured down the hallway, only to find the door ajar and the room empty. Mr. Whitaker was gone, and the room was in disarray. Margaret's journal chronicled her investigation into the disappearance of Mr. Whitaker. She uncovered rumors of secret meetings and clandestine activities involving the inn's owner and a select group of guests. Room 117, it seemed, was at the center of it all. As Margaret delved deeper, she discovered that the inn had a hidden past, one tied to the occult. The inn's original owner, a man named Elias Holloway, had been a known practitioner of dark arts. He believed that room 117 held a portal to another realm, a place where spirits and energies converged. Margaret's journal entries grew increasingly frantic as she described her encounters with shadowy figures and unexplained phenomena. She wrote of feeling trapped, as though the inn itself was conspiring to keep her from leaving. Her final entry was a desperate plea for help, written on the night she vanished. Henry closed the journal, his face pale. Margaret was trying to expose something far more sinister than we ever imagined. The inn's dark history is real. I felt a chill run down my spine as I absorbed the gravity of Margaret's story. Do you think Elias Holloway's influence still lingers here? Could the portal still exist? Henry's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We have to find out. If the portal is real, it could explain everything. The strange occurrences, the disappearances. We decided to search the room for any signs of the portal Margaret had described. With the journal as our guide, we focused on the details she had provided. According to her entries, the portal was hidden behind a false wall, marked by a symbol etched into the wood. We examined the walls closely, our flashlights revealing intricate carvings and faded patterns. Finally, we found it, a small, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the corner of the room. It was a circle with intersecting lines, resembling a primitive seal. Henry reached out and pressed the symbol. There was a soft click, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden chamber. The air inside was thick and heavy, and a faint, eerie glow emanated from within. We stepped into the chamber, our flashlights illuminating the strange symbols and markings that adorned the walls. In the center of the room was a small altar, upon which rested a worn, leather-bound tome. The glow seemed to emanate from the book itself. Henry approached the altar cautiously, his eyes fixed on the tome. This must be it, the source of the portal. He reached out and opened the book, revealing pages filled with arcane symbols and incantations. The air grew colder, and a low hum filled the chamber. We could feel the energy pulsating around us, as if the room were alive. Suddenly, the glow intensified, and the room was bathed in an otherworldly light. Shadows danced along the walls, and a chilling breeze swept through the chamber. We heard whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, as though voices from another realm were trying to communicate. Henry clutched the tome, his hands trembling. We have to close the portal. If we don't, it could unleash something terrible. I nodded, determined to help. What do we need to do? Henry scanned the pages, searching for the incantation Margaret had described in her journal. There's a ritual, a way to seal the portal for good, but it requires both of us to recite the incantation together. We stood side by side, our voices steady as we recited the ancient words. The room trembled, and the light intensified, blinding us momentarily. The whispers grew louder, reaching a crescendo as we completed the ritual. Suddenly, there was a deafening silence, followed by a rush of wind that extinguished the eerie glow. The chamber grew still, and the oppressive energy lifted. The portal was sealed. We stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of our actions sinking in. Henry closed the tome and placed it back on the altar, his expression one of relief and sorrow. "It's over," he said quietly. "Margaret's spirit can finally rest." We made our way back to the main part of the inn, the hidden door to room 117 now permanently sealed. The inn felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. As we stood in the lobby, the morning light filtering through the windows, Henry turned to me with a small smile. "Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you." I returned his smile, feeling a sense of accomplishment and peace. "I'm glad I could help. Margaret's story deserved to be told." In the days that followed, Henry shared Margaret's journal with a local historian, ensuring her story would be preserved and remembered. The Hollow Creek Inn continued to operate, but with a newfound sense of history and respect for the past. And as for me, I continued my work at the inn, forever changed by the experience. The mystery of room 117 had been solved, and with it, the dark secrets of the past had been laid to rest. When I was 20 years old, I started my very first real job as a helper at a local pub in a small town called Riverton. I didn't have the best living situation back home with my parents. They were going through a difficult divorce, and the atmosphere in the house was always tense, like a storm was constantly waiting to break. It wasn't easy, but one day, I found a small apartment that I could rent on my own. It was on Hazelwood Street, just a short walk from the pub where I worked. I was thrilled to finally have my own place to escape to. The apartment wasn't much. It was a small one-room unit with peeling wallpaper and a window that wouldn't close all the way, but it was mine. Having that space was a huge relief. After long days at the pub, I would retreat to my little sanctuary, invite a few friends over, and we'd drink sodas and tell stories, just trying to forget everything else. I was so grateful for the peace it brought me, but there was something strange about the place. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was the people who hung out by the bus stop at the end of the street. Every night, without fail, a group of boys, probably around my age, would gather there and hang out late into the night. At first, I thought they were just waiting for the last bus of the night, but as the hours passed, they didn't leave. They just kept talking and laughing loudly, and sometimes even shouting at each other. It was impossible to ignore them, especially when I was trying to sleep. My apartment window faced that bus stop, and I could hear everything. The laughter, the shouting, the clinking of bottles. Some nights, I would close my eyes and try to drift off to sleep, only for their voices to get louder and louder. It made it hard to get any rest, especially after working long shifts. Some nights I'd put on earplugs, and that helped a little, but it still wasn't enough. I started to get really annoyed with them. They didn't seem to care about the noise they were making, and when I first saw a couple of them get into trouble with the police, I thought it might calm them down. But no, it only made them bolder. They didn't care about being caught or getting in trouble. If anything, it seemed like they wanted to push the limits even more. Some nights I would peek out my window and see the police talking to them, but nothing ever seemed to change. It was spring when things really started to get strange. The weather was warmer, and the boys were back at the bus stop every night, as if they had never left. I started to notice something odd about them, though. It wasn't just their loud voices or their reckless behavior. It was how they acted around certain cars. Some nights, an unmarked car would pull up slowly, its headlights casting long shadows down the street. The boys would notice and immediately start moving around, like they were preparing for something. One or two of them would take off running, while the rest would just stand there staring at the car. I remember one night in particular. I was sitting in my room, playing a video game when I looked out the window and saw the boys at the bus stop. I watched as an unmarked car slowed down and stopped nearby. I thought it was just the police again, but this time something felt different. The boys didn't scatter like usual. Instead, they stayed in place and started shouting at the car, daring it to do something. I felt a strange sense of anticipation building in the air, like everyone was waiting for the next move. Then, without warning, there was a flash of light and a loud bang. One of the boys at the bus stop collapsed. His body just crumpled in the street like a rag doll. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I had never witnessed anything like that before. The boy who had fallen didn't get up. His body stayed still on the ground, and all I could hear was the screech of tires as the unmarked car sped off into the night. I ducked down behind the window, trying to hide from whatever was happening. My mind was racing. What had just happened? Was he dead? Should I call for help? I remember hearing other people in the neighborhood calling the police. I didn't know what to do, so I just stayed there, too afraid to move. The flashing lights of the police cars came soon after, but by then it was too late. The boy's friends had all scattered, leaving him behind. The police asked me a lot of questions, and I told them everything I had seen. But I couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had collapsed in the street. He had been one of the loud, obnoxious ones, but he didn't deserve to die like that. No one does. No one. After that night, the bus stop was empty. The boys never came back. The spot where they used to gather was quiet, and it seemed like the entire street had changed. Every time I walked past that bus stop, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. It haunted me for a long time. I ended up moving away from Riverton a year later, as soon as I could afford to. I found a new place to live, and I tried to forget everything that had happened. But every time I pass by a bus stop, I remember that night, and I wonder if anyone else has seen something like that too. I hope they haven't. No one should have to see what I saw. I still remember that night as if it happened just yesterday. My name is Oliver, and I work as the manager of the Pinewood Inn, a small but cozy hotel nestled in a quiet part of town. I've been working here for about 5 years, and I know most of the guests by heart. The inn is usually busy, but that night it was completely quiet. So quiet that I could hear every little sound. It was around 1 o'clock a.m., and I was sitting at the front desk, chatting with my colleague Jacob. We were talking about how strange it was to have such a slow night. The lobby was empty, no new guests had checked in for hours, and all the rooms seemed peaceful. Jacob laughed and said I was just being paranoid, that nothing bad ever happens when it's this quiet. But I've been working in hotels long enough to know that when it gets too quiet, something strange always happens. I've seen a lot during my time here. People arguing, odd phone calls, some even fighting in the hallways. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Around 1:30 a.m., right when I was about to take a break and stretch, the phone rang. I picked it up without thinking, expecting it to be a guest asking for something. But instead, I heard a small voice, a boy's voice. He sounded young, maybe 5 years old, and he said, "I want my mommy. Please, help me find my mommy." I was confused. I asked, "Is everything okay?" He answered, "Yes, but I need my mommy." I asked where he was, but before he could answer, a man's voice came on the line. The man quickly said, "I'm sorry, he's just a kid. Don't mind him." Then the phone went dead. I stared at the receiver, unsure of what to do. We didn't have the technology to track calls, and I had no idea where it came from. I decided to ask around to see if any of the staff had seen a child with a man. Most of my employees didn't know anything, but then I asked Luke, our restaurant manager, and he said he remembered a man coming in earlier with a little boy. They had used one of the hotel vouchers for a room, and Luke even wrote down the room number. I quickly ran to the staff room and grabbed Mark, one of the bigger guys on the team. I didn't want to get too involved. I just needed to make sure the boy was all right. I grabbed a towel, told Mark to stay by the elevator, and went to the room. I knocked on the door. It was answered by a man, short and chubby, smelling strongly of alcohol. Behind him, I could see the boy. He looked so tiny, sitting on the bed, covered in bruises, his ribs showing through his clothes. I tried to act calm. "I have the towels you requested," I said. The man didn't seem to care. He just grunted, shook his head, and slammed the door in my face. I didn't know what to do. I walked quickly back to the elevator, my heart racing. I got back to the front desk and immediately called the police. They told me to stay calm and not to make any more contact with the man. I sat at the desk, trying not to panic. My hands were shaking and my head was spinning. The police told me they would be there soon and asked me to come up with them to the room just in case there was a problem getting in. I agreed, even though I was terrified. The elevator ride up felt like it lasted forever. I could feel my chest tightening, and I kept thinking about what might be happening to that little boy. When we got to the floor, the officers told me to wait near the end of the hall. I could see them knock on the door, shouting at the man to open up. The man refused. He yelled back that he would hurt the boy if they tried to come in. I felt a wave of fear rush over me. The officers kept talking to the man, trying to convince him to open the door, but he wouldn't listen. He was angry, desperate. Finally, the police decided to force their way inside. The noise from the room was deafening, shouting, things being thrown around and crashing sounds. I could hear the officers shouting at the man. Moments later, I saw them walking out of the room, leading the man in handcuffs. But there was something else. One of the officers was holding the little boy in his arms. The boy looked so weak, like he couldn't hold his head up. His tiny body was so frail and his eyes were half closed. The boy was rushed to the hospital, and they said he would be okay. He was reunited with his mother later that day, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I learned that the man who had the boy was actually his father, a man named Caleb. Caleb had been abusing his wife for months, and when she decided to leave him, he took their son and ran. They'd been hiding at the hotel for over a month. The bruises on the boy were from Caleb beating him whenever he acted up. I cried when I heard about the boy's story. I couldn't imagine what he had gone through. The poor little guy would have to carry that pain with him for the rest of his life, even though he had been saved. I was glad he was safe, but my heart broke for him. I didn't know what would happen to Caleb, but I hoped he would never hurt anyone again. I still think about that little boy every night. I think about how he called out for his mommy, and how that's all he wanted. Someone to take care of him, someone to love him. That's all any of us need.